right. I really had fun reading this book.
Oh,
It's funny.
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I've been a romance reader for a long time, but it used to be like I would sort of do like one romance, one more serious thing, or one like literary thing. I hate that term because I feel like it's loaded, but and lately I've just been doing like straight romance and it's very fun.
That is the best way to go. When I was a kid, my mom used to say that, for every romance novel I got from the library, I had to get like, one nonfiction or one, classic literature book or something obnoxious. And you know, now like I rebel and I only read like 12 a year versus, you know, as many romances as I inhale on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I see a bunch of people dropping in. So we're going to go ahead and officially get started. So, hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Emily from Likewise, and I'm really excited to be chatting with Nisha Sharma about her newest adult romance, Dating Dr. Dill, which was a Book of the Month Club pick earlier in the spring. Nisha is also the author of 2 young adult romances, My So-Called Bollywood Life and Radha and Jai's Recipe for Romance, and another adult romance series, the Singh Family Trilogy. Her writing has been praised by NPR, in Cosmopolitan Magazine, in Teen Vogue, BuzzFeed, Entertainment Weekly, and lots more. She lives in Pennsylvania with her husband and her cat, Lizzie Bennett, and her dog, Nancy Drew. So some real literary bona fides there. If you haven't read Dating Dr. Dill yet, it follows Karina, who's a 30-year-old lawyer who dreams of meeting her soulmate, and Prem, who's a cardiologist who thinks that love is sort of troublesome at best and straight up bad for you at worst. Their initial meet cute goes awry, and when they cross paths again, it's clear that they really, really don't get along. But circumstances beyond their control, aka some aunties, seem to be conspiring to bring them together anyway. So Nisha, thanks so much for being here with us today. I'm really excited to chat about the book.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you. And thanks for everyone for hopping in.
Yes. So somebody has beat me to it. I was going to say, if you have a question, drop it in the chat there. It is a romantic book. It's a contemporary romance. It's a love story with all that entails. So that's a great way to kick it off. Nisha, let's talk about you and romance. When did you start reading romance, and when did you know that you wanted to write it?
Oh my gosh. I was obscenely young when I started reading adult romance. I It was the summer after 7th grade, and I had pretty much read most of the romance books in the like kid lit and the young adult section, and I ended up like wandering into the adult section of the library, and I saw this book with a beautiful like beachy scene on the cover, and I picked it up, and it was a Nora Roberts book, and that was the moment that I felt like my entire life changed, because it was my first adult contemporary romance, and I have been reading ever since.
I love that. So a couple of questions in the chat are about like the recommended age for this book. And I would say it's
Sure.
it's an adult
It's
romance.
18 plus.
Yeah.
Yep. It's 18 plus. I do write books for people under the age of 18. Have 2 young adult titles. But it is definitely 18 plus. And although it sounds like a Hallmark movie, which I'm flattered because I am obsessed with Hallmark holiday movies, it's a little spicier than that.
Yeah. It's definitely pretty spicy. So, yes, definitely like it is an adult title. The YA romances are My So-Called Bollywood Life and Radha and Jai's Recipe for Romance. So, Nisha, you talked a little bit about discovering Nora Roberts. When did you decide that you wanted to write romance?
I think I've like always been really interested in creating continuations of my favorite stories, but I'd have to say I was really a fan of Nancy Drew mysteries and Hardy Boy mysteries, and I don't know, Emily, if you remember this, but there was a joint series between Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys where they would
Yes, like a crossover.
they had a crossover series, and there was one book, it was like Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys and Secrets of the Nile, I think. And there was a scene where Nancy Drew and Frank Hardy like kissed on a terrace, and it like blew my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, this person is obviously her soulmate, but they're long lost loves because, you know, they're never in the same city, and she has this terrible boyfriend who's never supportive of her sleuthing activities. So, you know, obviously I have to write this. And I think that's when my romance writing started. It was like fan fiction that evolved into creating stories of my own.
I love that. So speaking of being inspired by other stories, this book was inspired by The Taming of the Shrew, which is not like Shakespeare's most feminist or progressive play, right? It's not a very progressive representation of women. What intrigued you about updating The Taming of the Shrew to make it a contemporary story?
So a few years ago, my husband and I were dating, and he lived in DC, and I was up in Pennsylvania, and I would go to visit him on weekends. And, you know, one of the things you do in DC is you check out all the libraries and the museums. And so we went to the Folger Library once just to check it out. And we're both nerds. So it was like a great place for us to, you know, just like kill some time. And the Folger Library has the largest collection of what's called Shakespeare Folios. So folios are like sheets of paper that Shakespeare wrote his original plays on. But we were talking to one of the scholars there, and the scholar basically, he was explaining to us that no one really knows what the original folio is. And that's because Shakespeare used to change his plays to basically fit the audience that the play was being performed in front of. And so every folio has a little bit of a variation in language, in jokes, in tone, in order to kind of like be catered to the right audience. And so in that moment, I thought to myself, like, what if I took some of the, and the thing that I don't think they teach in high school, and I don't think that they do a good job at, like, when kind of talking about Shakespeare, is that Shakespeare plays, they slap. I mean, like, there are some serious, like, funny moments and great character development in these stories. And so I thought, what if I take some of these beats and push it through like a South Asian perspective, like a South Asian lens? And so that's how Dating Dr. Dill was conceived. It was part of a trilogy of 3 of my favorite plays. And Taming of the Shrew in particular, I started with it because, one, it's, you know, it is the hardest since it's the least progressive. But what I really wanted to tackle is basically like taking the beats of Taming of the Shrew and flipping it on its head. So that's essentially what Dating Dr. Dill does. It takes like so in Taming of the Shrew, basically what happens is, like, this guy comes to town, he needs money, and basically they tell him, hey, you know, there's this one woman you can marry for her dowry, but she's considered a shrew. She's literally the most terrible human being ever. I disagree wholeheartedly. I think Kate was just, you know, maligned in the in the play. She was amazing. But he says yes, and the rest of the play is basically he starves her, he keeps her sleep deprived, and then he manipulates her into agreeing with his point of view. That is what Taming of the Shrew essentially is. And so in Dating Dr. Dill, Prem, what he does is, like, he's always feeding the heroine. He's the one who has to change his mind at the end of the story, and the only place the heroine feels that she can sleep a full night is with him. So I essentially flipped the play. And that was kind of how I wanted to approach the story. I wanted to take this really anti-feminist take and make it a feminist narrative.
I like that. So if you're just joining us, we're talking to Nisha Sharma about her newest adult romance, Dating Dr. Dill. One thing that I really loved about reading this book is, as you alluded to, it's just full of South Asian culture, full of Desi culture, from food to matchmaking traditions to language. And I saw a really great TikTok review where the TikTok creator mentioned that she loved how much she learned from the book. And I did too. As someone who's not super familiar with Desi culture, not in Desi culture, knowing that you'll have readers who are like me and this TikTok person coming to it with no knowledge, and also that you'll have readers who are familiar with Desi culture, how do you think about writing for two audiences who have really different knowledge levels?
So like my background is in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was a DEI consultant, and then I currently am head of a DEI organization. Like that's like considered my day job. And one of the things that I'm always talking about, both in publishing and in, just working with individuals in the space, is the idea of a global audience. We are no longer like catering to a particular audience. We are thinking about our readers being from different countries all over the world, different perspectives all over the world. And so the way that I approach writing my story is how I would engage in the narrative as a South Asian, because I'm writing South Asian characters. And so like how would I process some of this information as the writer, as a person reading the book? And that's like the very first question I ask, like how am I understanding this? And then usually what happens is like I will give it to a bunch of readers, and my readers are very diverse, and I'll ask them like, does this make sense to you in this context? And I will then have to either like pare back some of the explanation because it's bogging it down and it's pretty self-explanatory, or I'll have to drop in more context clues. And I prefer context clues rather than like direct like explanation, because I feel like that pulls a reader out of the story. But yeah, that's generally how I approach writing to it. I think of like my readers from being from everywhere. And basically like the characters are just living their truth and living their lives. And like, I'll have to just give enough context so that, my diverse audience will be able to pick it up. And honestly, I need to trust my readers as well. And like, as a reader myself, like I'm coming from a specific perspective. If I don't understand something, I'll look it up. So I need to also trust my readers to be able to do the same.
Yeah. So in romance, a lot of times I think we see heroes and heroines who either have a really loving and supportive family, or a family that's either sort of absent or they're like really, really at odds with. But one thing I love about the family relationships in this novel is they're like a little more complicated than that. Both these main characters love their families, but also find themselves at odds with them. Can you talk about the role of family in the book?
Yeah, sure. This is, by the way, like a super polarizing topic. The amount of people who have like come to me at signings and been like, I don't understand why, like, they didn't have a heart to heart at the end of the story or something. It's a really polarizing topic. And like, funny enough, it's like the oldest daughters are always like, Karina was right. And the youngest daughters will be like, I think you misrepresented Bindu, who's the sister. So in the story, I went back and forth a few times. So to for everyone on the call, like to give you all context, Karina has a very complicated relationship with her father, who has still yet to really process the grief of losing his wife. She has like her grandmother is relatively regressive and doesn't understand Karina, and her sister pushes boundaries with Karina regularly. And Karina, to a fault, is constantly making excuses for her family. And so a lot of the family dynamics that are in Dating Dr. Dill, I think, are real experiences for family dynamics that, some families have today. So they're not romanticized. Like, you're not looking at it like a fictional family that has, you know, like in Full House, at the end of every episode, they would have a conversation and everything would be dandy. Like, that is not the case in Dating Dr. Dill. And although it's a rom-com, I actually thought about like having those moments at the end of the book, just because I knew that it was a rom-com and I wanted a lot of the story to be light. But in Taming of the Shrew, all of the family dynamics are left unsettled, because in reality, if someone is going to be terrible to you for your like most of your life, and you have this push and pull relationship with them, is one chat really going to make or break, like make or change the entire relationship? Like, no. I mean, in reality, it's not. So I felt like it was so disingenuous to have, you know, them kind of try to talk it out and like hug it out at the end of the book. Instead, they kind of like tripped over it, like they did with all of their arguments, and proceeded to, you know, have a complicated family relationship. Just like, it's just another speed bump in the way that they kind of love each other and they live with each other.
So speaking of family, I love Karina's aunties, who are not actually family, but close enough. Can you tell us a little bit about who they are, who inspired them, and also who they're named after?
Yeah, sure. So the four aunties in Dating Dr. Dill are actually named after South Asian writers who are writing today. So Mona Shroff is Mona Auntie, Sonali Dev is Sonali Auntie, Farah Heron is Farah Auntie, and Falguni Kothari, who writes women's fiction, is Falguni Auntie. And all of them, as South Asian writers, unfortunately there's so few of us writing contemporary romance. And so I'd say most of us are on the same Slack channel, the same Slack group. And so I was trying to name the aunties, and I needed to kind of keep them all straight in my head, and all of their names and information straight in my head. So I just sent a message out to all of the South Asian Desi writers, and I said, can I use some of your names for like my aunties? And the only one who really had a comment was like Mona Shroff. She's like, just make sure I have really good hair, because Mona always has great hair. And so in Dating Dr. Dill, Mona Auntie always has the great blowout. So that's how the aunties were named. But they were also one of my favorite, you know, parts of Dating Dr. Dill that I got to write, because in South Asian culture, oftentimes you'll like see that the aunties or auntie culture is perpetuating like oppressive qualities of like the culture. They're the ones who are pushing colorism or prejudice or racism or casteism. And so to have supportive aunties is actually very much a privilege in a lot of spaces. And so I was fortunate to have amazing supportive aunties, and I wanted to give Karina a safe space where she felt like she had, you know, parental figures growing up. And so the aunties in Dating Dr. Dill were her mother's friends before her mother died, and they take the responsibility of taking care of Karina very seriously. And I think that's what makes them so special, because no matter what they're doing, they're always doing it from, you know, a place of love and support. So that's why you know, to me, they're one of the most special parts of the story.
Yes, I agree. They're wonderful, and I hope that we'll get to see them again
You
in the
will.
future. Yay! So when you're writing this book, did you have a favorite part, your favorite part of the book to write? Favorite scene, favorite character?
You know what? I have to say, so there's a date that they both go on, and like Prem is trying to like convince Karina that like they should fake dates, and they never get to the fake dating part. They kind of just like jump into the dating part. But like in this moment right before whatever is happening between them becomes real, he takes her on this date to do like a murder mystery thing at a museum. And that was really fun to write, because so for my husband's like 35th birthday, I took him on that date. So we found a company that did murder mystery theater at like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And we walked in and both of us were like, we're, you know, the oldest child of immigrant parents. We're overachievers. Like we walked in like with a swagger. We're like, we're going to kill this. We're going to totally find out who had, you know, who killed like Colonel Mustard with the butter knife, whatever, in the library. We got this. And so we did this date, and we lost so terribly. We were like the last people to show up, and on top of that we had the answer wrong. So I felt like I was able to rewrite history in that moment. And have a really fun date situation in Dating Dark.
Yes, I love that scene. And I was like, I want to go on this date. This sounds so fun.
It was a lot of fun. I mean, we left with like serious disappointment, but it was a lot of fun.
Now you've redeemed yourself in fiction. So
yes.
On the other end, what part of this book was the most challenging to write?
I think the most challenging for me was to write Prem's character, because Prem is like the toxic like the toxic bro dude who like you don't want anything to do with in real life, and in fiction like is portrayed as like someone who's seriously misunderstood. And I have been wrestling with, in Dating Dr. Lil, I was wrestling back and forth with how much reality of dating I wanted to include in the book. And so he was the most difficult. Like I have to say, I read so many white papers and research articles about people who truly believe that love is like a drug, and it is a terrible, terrible thing. And I like put all of that research into his personality, and that's kind of, you know, how I was able to develop him as a character. But even then it was like, I mean, do I like this guy? Like I had to peel it back, and really like I struggled with him for a while until I felt like, okay, like I really like this character now. I like him as a hero, and he has the redeeming qualities that I need him to have. And he's attentive, and he's constantly challenging Karina because he knows that Karina is smarter, stronger, better than she believes that she herself can be.
Yeah, I really liked him, but I think, you know, going back to Taming of the Shrew, you're also like, you're not necessarily starting from like a place of that main character is also like kind of a like gross bro who's just trying to marry her for money, right? So, but yes, exactly. I really came around on Prim too. And then this is an audience question that's kind of related. How do you stay motivated to write? Maybe when you're dealing with a tricky character or a tricky scene, this person says they want to be an author, but they can't stay motivated to stick with one idea.
I think it's like that is being being self-motivated is one of the hardest things to do as a writer. For me, the best thing that I found as like a solution to that is to find a group of people who are as passionate about telling stories as you are, and create an accountability group. Like for me, the way that I started getting really motivated to finish a novel versus hopping from story to story was very early on in my career. I joined National Novel Writing Month. And so NaNoWriMo was a place that like so for those of you who don't know, like it takes place in November. They have like some summer camp sessions now too, but it's nanowrimo.org. So it's NaNoWrimo.org. And it's basically like you have to finish a 50,000 word novel in 30 days. And you join a regional group. They have like live write-ins. They have virtual write-ins. They have like really phenomenal opportunities for writers to like connect with like craft experts. They have newsletters. And so I was able to find my group of people, and we would sit and write together, and we would challenge each other, and we'd ask each other story questions. And like, if you're halfway through a book, it's, you know, it's usually called like the sagging middle once you hit that halfway mark, because that's when like people start to find the story is either getting tedious, or as the writer, you feel like it's getting tedious. I always find that like I've made a mistake 25 pages or 10 pages even earlier. So I go back and I redirect the characters, and that is all often a place where I found like that's where I've made a mistake, and that's how I can reinvigorate myself and get interested in the story again. So like that's my craft advice and my career advice. So join NaNoWriMo, and also like think about your starting spot and where you may have like gone off on a tangent.
Thank you. I put the website for NaNoWriMo in the chat there. So if you're curious about Nano, that's where you can learn more. So Dating Dr. Dale is an enemies to lovers romance. And I will say that is not always my favorite trope, because I think you have to establish this enemy relationship and then you have to get them over it, which is really hard. But I was rooting for them the whole time. So I'm curious what you like about enemies to lovers and how you think about balancing that tension with the romance.
I think like when I started writing Dating Dr. Dill, I actually never really thought of it as an enemies to lovers story. I thought like for a second they may have been enemies, but for the most part it's like they are two people who have totally different philosophies on happiness. And in this battle of wits, they're just trying to understand how the other person who seems so perfect for them could not understand this one philosophy that is really a make it or break it for them. And so, you know, I think like when I started writing the story, like I didn't really think about the trope. I focused on like the character motivation, and that helped me really figure out like where they were coming from and like the hurdle that they had to cross and they had to jump over in order to like find happiness together. It wasn't until like after the book was done that my editor's like, oh, like, you know, you really did leaned into the enemies to lovers and Taming of the Shrew. I'm like, I did not plan
that. I want to talk about tropes in general, because I feel like romance, one of the things that's so fun about talking about romance is people have like really strong opinions and favorite tropes. And I'm wondering if you have favorites as a writer, as a reader, or if you even think about romance that way.
Oh my gosh. Like both of my answers are like, you know, have elicited like abject horror on TikTok. So like I often don't admit to it, but I'll share it here with like 193 of you. That my my favorite trope to write is insta love, like love at first sight. Just because I love the magic of the moment, and as realistic as it may, if it's you know, if it's not for people, it's not for people. It is what it is. But like I know that it's not as realistic, but like I grew up watching Bollywood movies, and there was something really special in Bollywood movies when the characters would see each other like across like a crowded room, and everything, including their heart, just stops. And like it's just that kind of connection, just like growing up like appreciating it, is something that I really love to explore in fiction. And the one that I like to read is also incredibly embarrassing. It's also 18 plus, and like if there are any recommendations that, you know, like you need, I can post them on TikTok. Just find me on TikTok. But it's Accidental Pregnancy and Secret Baby, and usually Secret Baby in a mafia romance setting. So
Amazing. This is what I'm saying. Like tropes it's like such a deep and wide world, you know?
Yeah, it's really funny when I tell people that. They're like, you write rom-coms, and I'm like, yes, well, for now I write rom-coms.
Well, I'm looking forward to your South Asian accidental pregnancy mafia romance.
It's happening one day.
Fantastic. Do you have a couple of recs that you could share with the audience?
I can share like general books that I've just been loving lately, because
Perfect.
of course, like the ones with my favorite tropes have completely escaped my mind.
Yes.
But I just finished rereading A Caribbean Heiress in Paris by Adriana Herrera. That is also 18 plus. It's a historical romance. The heroine is a rum maker from the Caribbean who meets a Scottish, like, I guess not royalty, I don't know what they're called, but like was someone with title, and he has like space for like a whiskey distillery, and there's an arranged marriage, and also the hero has a hand flex, so it's pretty wonderful. He has a hand flex moment for those of you who are Pride and Prejudice fans. Then the other book that I also just really enjoyed was American Royalty by Tracy Livesey. So American Royalty is also a contemporary romance. It is a rap artist who falls in love with a prince. So it is like Meghan Harry vibes, which is pretty amazing.
So we will share a list of these picks, and also I'll include books from the authors that you mentioned that the aunties are named after. We'll put it in the romance room after the event, so listeners don't worry about keeping track of all of those. I haven't read American Royalty yet, but I loved A Caribbean Heiress in Paris. It was so fun. Such an interesting, like, I feel like we're starting to get more
really
historical romance that's not just set in like, I mean, I have nothing against Regency, but it's fun to like branch out a little bit. You've got Paris at like the turn of the century.
Yeah, Gilded Age Paris.
Yeah. It was a great one. So thank you for those. Let's see. So we've talked a little bit about how Dating Dr. Dill is based on The Taming of the Shrew, and it's the first in a Shakespeare-inspired trilogy called If Shakespeare Was an Auntie. Can you tell us what plays the other two titles are based on and when we might get to read them?
So next year, we're still kind of figuring out the dates, and I can't announce the title quite yet for the second book, but it is Bobby and Bunty's story. So if you read Dating Dr. Dill, like, Bobby is Karina's friend, Bunty or Benjamin is Prem's friend, and he's a chef and she's a wedding planner, and there may be a wedding involved in the story. The book is inspired by Much Ado About Nothing, which is my favorite Shakespeare play of all time. And of
Fantastic.
course, the last one comes out in 2 years, but I can share that it's inspired by 12th Night.
Ooh, fun. All right, so we will be on the lookout for those. If you have a question for Nisha, don't forget to put it into the chat, and we can ask her. You have talked a lot on social media, and just as I was getting ready for this interview, in other interviews, about the need for better representation in romance. And I'm wondering if you think representation in romance has changed at all since your first book came out, and where you think the most change is still needed.
So I think that I actually just was interviewed for an article on USA Today about this. It's a really great article. There's a bunch of other people who were interviewed. I think it's called, romance has diversified, but we still have a long way to go. Something like that. It's linked on my website. So if you go on my website in the news section, I've linked the article there. But I think that we are still underrepresented in most, if not all, of the subgenres in romance. We being marginalized communities. So queer romances, romances with disabled persons, romances that have BIPOC representation. I think across the board, there's just underrepresentation. And so the way that we as in publishing, has been approaching that is just reaching out, acquiring diverse authors, and pushing the diverse titles out, which in theory would work. But the problem is the system is not designed to support diverse titles. So diverse titles are not getting marketing support. They're not getting the same pay. There was like this whole campaign last year on Twitter that I don't even know if the link is still like floating around out there, but it's like, how much did publishing pay me? And authors were disclosing their advances, and you could see how significantly underpaid romance diverse authors were compared to not diverse authors. Like, we're talking like Angie Thomas, who wrote The Hate You Give, was getting paid significantly less than people who did not have nearly as much success as her titles had. So I think that the system itself needs to be revitalized and revamped in order to be more inclusive. So that means like not, and the way that you kind of look at diversity in publishing is kind of like a Jenga tower. There are multiple pieces, and you have to fit all the pieces together in order to uphold a structure. Otherwise, everything just falls apart. So not only is there more diverse acquisitions, but diversity in marketing campaigns. Like, instead of just trying to plug and play the same type of marketing campaign across multiple authors, like, what kind of marketing campaigns can you do to support a global audience, a global readership with diverse authors? In addition to that, pay equity, diverse editors, diverse finance people, training across the board. So I think all of these things kind of just need to be just reviewed, revitalized, so that people just, I think, have the tools, the knowledge, and they have access to resources to do their job with inclusion in mind, and also support diverse authors better.
Thank you. That's great. I know that's sort of where your day job crosses over with your work, with your writing. So thanks. That's all really important, and such a good point that, like, there are many more diverse titles now than there were 2 decades ago, and yet there's still a lot of structural change that needs to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. With James Patterson making a fool out of himself like 2 days ago, there was an individual who wrote a Medium article who explained like what the diversity breakdown on the USA Today list was, to showcase how underrepresented certain titles were, certain author groups, certain demographics were. And I think that's like if you search on like on Twitter, like James Patterson diversity, I think it's one of the first few tweets that comes up. So I recommend that as well.
Thank you. So we are getting close to wrapping up. So if you have a question for Nisha, don't forget to drop it in the chat. I'm wondering if you could tell us what's on your to-read list this summer.
Oh my goodness. So I am currently making my way through all of the Nalini Singh Side Changeling books again. I'm rereading the whole series because I want to read Storm Echo, which I think it just came out or it's coming out soon. And I have this like obsession with her characters because I absolutely love paranormal fantasy romance, and reading through the whole series to prepare for the next release is like something I have not done in a while. So so that is my big like summer reading plan.
That's a serious project. How many of those books are there? Do you know off the top of your head how many there are?
I think there's like over 20 now.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of those books.
They're so good though. I know that we're seeing like a revitalization and of like paranormal romance and fantasy romance, specifically like low fantasy. And if anyone is interested in, paranormal fantasy romance, Nalini Singh Side Changeling series is a great like gateway series. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you. We will put that on the list too, for any listeners who are wondering what that series is all about and where to start. We'll put a couple books on the list. And then our last question that we ask everybody, since Likewise is a cross-category platform, and you sort of already answered this, so feel free to repeat yourself, but can you tell us about the last great book you read, the last great show or movie you watched, and the last great podcast that you listened to?
Oh my goodness. So there's a podcast. I'll start with a podcast. There's a podcast that like goes through every Buffy episode. And I don't even remember the name of the podcast. But basically it's like a deep dive analysis of every Buffy episode that has ever come out. And I highly recommend that podcast if you are a Buffy fan. The other podcast that I'm a huge fan of is Fated Mates. They're doing a Trailblazers series. So if you are a romance reader and you love the history of the romance genre, Fated Mates Trailblazer episodes, basically they're interviewing all of these authors who started, in the industry. Like they started trends or major shifts in the industry. They just did E. Ottoman, who is the first out trans romance author. They also did Nora Roberts, Sandra Brown, like all of these major mega talents. So Fated Mates. The last show that I watched was Bridgerton, because obviously, and so I absolutely loved it. I mean, I think like I'm bracing myself to see what they do for the next season, but I'm excited. And the last book I read, I of course, Adriana Herrera and Tracy Livesey are incredible. I also, like everyone else on Likewise and TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, read Book Lovers by Emily Henry. And Emily always knocks it out of the park. So I have to say that, of course, Emily's book is amazing. And then a nonfiction book that I read. I'm a voracious reader, so I can go on forever about like books that I love. It's called The Burnout Book. So I reread it. I bought it when it first came out, and I didn't really pick it up until like maybe a year and a half ago or something. And I try to reread it every like 6 months, like just do the exercises. The Burnout Book is really great for creatives who feel like they're just so exhausted. So I think it's written by the Nagoski sisters. And really, if you just type in burnout, it's like it'll come up as a resource. So if you are into, like self-care, but like really strategic ways to manage your burnout to make sure that you don't deplete your energy, pick up the Burnout Book. Highly recommend it.
Okay, thank you for all of those. Is the Buffy podcast Buffering the Vampire Slayer?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure we have the right one. Also, it's a great name for a podcast.
It really is.
Speaking of paranormal romance, you are working on a paranormal romance. Is that right?
My first one. It is a young adult though. So it's a young adult paranormal fantasy romance. It's my Buffy fan fiction. So I was a fan of Buffy growing up. And the show, I felt like they did Kendra dirty. I felt like there were so many things that they could have done differently in the show if there was more diversity. And so I am writing a South Asian Buffy inspired paranormal YA.
Fantastic. That sounds super fun. Well, thank you so much for being with us. This was a really fun chat. Can you tell listeners where else they can find you and learn about your work?
Sure. So you can find me on TikTok or on Instagram or on Twitter, actually, all of them at the same place, or with the same handle, Nisha Writes, WRITES. You can also, I just put my website in the chat. You can find me on my website, which is where all my social media links are. And I have a Substack. So my newsletter is now a Substack. And in a couple of weeks, I'll be posting my next newsletter, which will have a bunch of things about like mid-year, like, checkup, like what can you do to just like evaluate, how you're doing with your reading, with your romance, with everything. So that's going to be in my next newsletter.
Sounds great. Well, thank you again. It was really fun to chat with you. And if you all haven't had a chance to read this book, I highly recommend it. It's a great read.
Oh, thanks for having me. And this was really fun.
Yeah, my pleasure. So, listeners, before you go, just wanted to give you a heads up about a couple more events that we have coming up. Next Tuesday at 4 p.m., we have some publishing insiders, some publicists from a couple of different publishing houses talking about the best new romance coming out this summer. So, that's a great way to grow your TBR if you're looking for even more romance to read. And then next Friday, we have a couple of events. We have a panel of some book talk people talking about their favorite Pride reads. That's at 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern. And then we have an introduction to historical romance if you're a person who loved Bridgerton but hasn't read historical romance. And we'll have historical romance authors Sabrina Jeffries and Vanessa Riley for that one. That's at 4 Pacific, whatever that is, 7 Eastern. Sorry, it's too much math for me in the afternoon. So thank you all again. Thank you, Nisha. This was really fun.
I'm so glad I could do this. Thanks everyone for popping in.